There is one photograph of the wedding. It was taken by a friend, released on the couple's terms, and printed on the front page of newspapers on 3 continents. 40 people had been present. The image was the only thing that left the island. 9 days later, they came back to New York. The photographers had worked out the address on Northmore Street. From that autumn until the summer of 1999, a woman who had never sought public attention could not carry groceries into her own building without being recorded. Almost everything the public believes it knows about the next 1,000 days was published after she was dead. The marriage was described in books by men she had not spoken to, sourced to friends who were never named, sold in a market that had already established what her face was worth. Some of it is supported by evidence, much of it is not, and the difference has mostly been ignored. What follows is an attempt to separate the two, to set the documented record beside the accounts that were written when neither of them could answer. It begins on an island in Georgia, chosen because no one could reach it. Cumberland Island sits at the southern edge of Georgia, 18 miles long, reachable by ferry, private boat, or a grass airstrip. Most of it is federal land. There are no bridges. In September 1996, there were fewer than 50 full-time residents, no through roads, and no reliable telephone service across large sections of the interior. These were the qualifications that mattered. The connection came through the Ferguson family, descendants of Thomas Carnegie, who had bought most of the island in the 1880s. Gogo Ferguson, a jewelry designer, had known John Kennedy for years. Her family ran the Grayfield Inn, a converted Carnegie house on the western shore with a small number of rooms. The island's isolation, which had been a private inconvenience for a century, was now the reason to go there. The planning was handled largely by Rosemarie Terencio, Kennedy's assistant at George, and it was conducted as a containment operation. Guests received an invitation with a date and an instruction to fly to Jacksonville, Florida. The location was not printed. Those who asked were told only that transport would be arranged. From Jacksonville, they were driven to Fernandina Beach and taken across the water by boat. Several later described being uncertain, until they arrived, of what state they would be sleeping in. The number of guests was around 40. The ceremony was held at the First African Baptist Church, a one-room whitewashed building constructed by freed slaves in the settlement at the north end of the island, later rebuilt in the 1930s. It seats about 24 people. It has no electricity. The evening service was lit by candles and kerosene lamps, which was not a design choice. Father Charles O'Byrne, a Jesuit and a friend, performed the ceremony. Anthony Radziwill, Kennedy's cousin and closest friend, stood as best man. Carolyn Kennedy's children were among the small procession. Carolyn's sisters, Lauren and Lisa, twins, were part of the wedding party. Ted Kennedy was present, and Morris Templesman, and a short list of others. The guest list was assembled by two people who had decided in advance that anyone whose attendance could not be trusted would not be told. The dress was designed by Narciso Rodriguez, then working at Cerruti in Paris, a friend of the bride from her years at Calvin Klein. Bias-cut silk crepe, long-sleeved, unadorned, with a silk tulle veil. It cost a fraction of what most people assumed. Within 2 years, it had been copied at every price point in the American bridal market, which is a strange fate for a garment made specifically so that no one would see it. Dennis Reggie photographed the wedding. He was a working photojournalist and also a member of the extended family. His sister Victoria had married Ted Kennedy 4 years earlier, which meant he could be inside the operation rather than outside it. He took a picture on the church steps of John Kennedy bending to kiss his wife's hand. It ran on front pages across the world. That was the arrangement, and it was deliberate. One image, controlled, released, and given away. Everything else stayed on the island. The news broke that evening, after the fact. A statement was issued on the couple's behalf, brief and formal, describing the day as a private one and thanking the press for allowing it to remain so. The thanks were preemptive. Nobody had allowed anything. The press had simply not known. For roughly 12 hours, it had worked completely. It is worth stopping on what this required because the effort involved was not ordinary, and the people involved were not equally practiced at it. John Kennedy had spent his life inside a negotiation with photographers. He was born into it, and by 1996, he had made a career that ran on it. George had launched a year earlier, in September 1995, an attempt to cover politics as culture, and its viability depended substantially on his ability to attract attention to it. He appeared in its pages. He appeared in advertising campaigns. He gave the magazine's early press conferences himself and made jokes at them. He understood publicity as a currency he had been born holding and had decided to spend. Carolyn Bessette had no such history. She had worked in fashion, which meant she had worked on the production side of image making, dressing other people, managing clients, deciding what the public would be shown of someone else. She was fluent in the mechanics. She had never been the subject. Their engagement had been kept quiet for months. She had been photographed with him for the first 2 years of the relationship, in the incidental way that girlfriends of famous men are photographed. Unnamed, then named, then followed. There was a period in 1995 and early 1996 when the press was still working out who she was. That period ended with the wedding. Friends interviewed afterward, and here the record thins, because most of them spoke only after her death, and some spoke to people who paid, described her as having had reservations about the scale of what she was entering. Terencio, who worked beside her daily and whose account came from inside the office rather than from the outside, described a woman who was funny, profane, extremely sharp about other people's motives, and increasingly aware that the marriage would not be a private one no matter how the wedding was arranged. None of that can be verified as a state of mind. What can be established is the logistics, that the two of them, at considerable trouble and expense, organized a ceremony designed so that no camera could reach it, on an island with no bridge, in a church with no power, in front of 40 people bound by an implied contract of silence. They honeymooned in Turkey, on a chartered boat along the Aegean coast, and were photographed there as well. They came back to New York at the beginning of October. The loft on Northmore Street, in Tribeca, occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse. The neighborhood in 1996 was not what it later became. It was industrial, quiet at night, with wide sidewalks and few reasons for anyone to loiter. That changed almost immediately. The address had been known to a handful of photographers before the wedding. Afterward, it was known to all of them. The building's entrance was on a corner, visible from two directions, with no garage, no service entrance suitable for regular use, and no doorman arrangement capable of screening the street. There was one door, and it opened onto a public sidewalk. Within weeks, a standing rotation had established itself outside it. Some of the photographers worked for agencies. Some worked for themselves and sold to whoever paid most that week. They arrived early and stayed late because the couple kept irregular hours, and because the value of the pictures justified the wait in a way that almost no other target in New York did at that moment. The economics were straightforward. A photograph of John Kennedy alone was worth something. A photograph of the two of them together was worth several times that. And a photograph of her in visible distress, arguing, crying, shielding her face, walking fast, was worth considerably more than either. The market had priced her expressions before she had any idea it was doing so. She began to alter her routine. She left the building at different times. She used other exits when she could find them. She took cars for distances that would have been walked. Neighbors later described a woman who moved quickly and did not stop on the street. None of this stopped anything. It produced a slightly different set of pictures. There is a particular kind of evidence available for this period that is not available for most of her life, which is that the surveillance itself created a record. Thousands of frames exist of a woman walking from a door to a car. They are dated, they can be counted. From the autumn of 1996 onward, the volume does not drop off, which is unusual. Attention of this kind normally decays. Hers did not, for reasons that had to do with how she looked, how rarely she spoke, and how completely she declined to give anyone a version of herself to use. Silence, in that market, was not a defense. It was a shortage, and shortages raise prices. The island had been chosen because it could not be reached. That logic had worked once, for one day, at the cost of enormous planning and the cooperation of 40 people who kept their word. There was no equivalent arrangement available for the rest of it. The wedding had been an event with a perimeter. A marriage in downtown Manhattan had a front door. By November, the photographs appearing in the tabloids were no longer of the couple arriving somewhere. They were of the couple leaving home. The distinction seemed minor at the time and would turn out not to be, because the second kind of photograph requires someone to be waiting, and someone waiting outside your building every morning is not covering an event. He is covering you. 4 months after the wedding, in a public park, a few minutes' walk from that door, a stranger with a video camera would film them for the better part of an hour. She was born in White Plains, New York, on the 7th of January, 1966, the third daughter of William Bessette and Anne Messina. Her sisters, Lauren and Lisa, were twins, 3 years older. The family was Catholic, second generation, comfortable without being wealthy. Her father worked in manufacturing. Her mother would spend most of her career in the New York City public school system, eventually in administration. The marriage ended when Carolyn was around 8. Her mother remarried Richard Freeman, an orthopedic surgeon, and the household moved to Greenwich, Connecticut. This is the fact most often cited about her upbringing, and it is usually cited to establish something it does not establish. Greenwich in the 1970s contained several distinct populations: old money on the back roads, new money on the water, and a substantial professional middle class in between, which is where a surgeon's family sat. She was not raised in the world she was later assumed to have come from. She was raised close enough to see it. She attended St. Mary's, a Catholic high school in Greenwich with a few hundred students. The record of those years is thin and consists mostly of the yearbook, in which she was voted the ultimate beautiful person by the class of 1983. Classmates interviewed decades later, after there was a reason to interview them, remembered her as popular and unusually unbothered by the categories teenagers use on each other. That is the kind of memory that improves with time and with a dead subject, and it should be weighted accordingly. She went to Boston University. She spent her first years in the College of Basic Studies, a 2-year program that fed into the university's other schools, and finished in the School of Education with a degree in elementary education in 1988. She had, on paper, trained to teach small children. She did not teach. She took a job on the sales floor of a Calvin Klein boutique in Chestnut Hill, outside Boston, which was the kind of position taken by graduates who have a degree and no particular attachment to it. What happened next is the only part of her early career that is genuinely documented because it happened in front of the company's executives. Susan Sokol, then a senior executive at Calvin Klein, encountered her in the Boston store. The account, given later by people who were there, is that Sokol watched her handle customers and concluded she was in the wrong building. Within a relatively short period, she was offered a role in New York. Consider what that offer was actually for. Retail salespeople are promoted for volume. She was recruited for something else: an ability to tell people what they should wear and have them agree without the transaction feeling like a transaction. That is a specific and fairly rare skill, and the company had a use for it. She moved to Manhattan in the early 1990s. Her title changed several times, which is normal in fashion, and the descriptions of her role vary between publicity, showroom management, and client services. The substance of it did not vary much. She ran the part of Calvin Klein that dressed people whose appearance was a public matter. This meant fittings for actresses before award ceremonies, for network anchors, for the wives of men in politics and finance, for musicians, for anyone whose photograph was going to be taken and studied. The clients were significant. The work was not glamorous in the way it sounds. It involved standing in a room with someone who was anxious about how they were going to look in the morning and managing both the garment and the anxiety. Two things about that job matter for everything that followed. The first is that she became, professionally, an expert in the mechanics of public image. She knew which photographs get printed and which do not. She knew that a particular neckline reads differently on a step and repeat than in a fitting room, that certain fabrics fail under flash, that a woman photographed from below is being made into something. She understood the apparatus from the inside as a technician. The second is that the job required absolute discretion. She was in a room with famous people who were partly undressed and frequently unhappy. Nothing that happened in those rooms could be repeated. Her value to the company depended in large part on the certainty that she would not talk. She spent roughly 5 years being paid for silence about other people's vanity, which is not a bad apprenticeship for what came later, and is also the reason there is almost no first-person record of her professional life. She kept the habit after she had stopped being paid for it. Her own appearance during these years was a matter of deliberate subtraction. Black, gray, white, navy, almost no jewelry. Hair straight and pale. She had begun lightening it in Boston. Little makeup. She wore Yohji Yamamoto and Prada and Miu Miu and the plainer end of her own employer's line, and the effect was less about luxury than about refusal. Nothing that asked to be looked at, on a woman who was looked at constantly. Fashion writers later described this as minimalism and treated it as a style movement she happened to lead. It was also, functionally, camouflage that did not work. She met John Kennedy Jr. somewhere in this period. The accounts do not agree, which is itself informative about how much of the surrounding record is reconstruction. One version has him coming into the Calvin Klein offices to be fitted for suits. Another has them meeting while running in Central Park. Another places the introduction through mutual friends. The dating is equally loose. Some sources put a first meeting as early as 1992, others in 1994, when the relationship is generally agreed to have begun in earnest. He was involved at the time with the actress Daryl Hannah in a relationship that had run intermittently for years and that ended, definitively, in 1994. She was involved with Michael Bergen, a model who appeared in Calvin Klein underwear campaigns and who would later write a book about all of this. Neither relationship ended cleanly, and the overlaps between them became, after 1999, a small industry. What is documented is that by 1995, they were living together in the loft on North Moore Street, and that the press had begun to identify her. In August of that year, John's mother had been dead a little over a year. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in May 1994, and the effect of her death on her son's life was not primarily emotional in any way outsiders could measure. It was structural. She had been the one member of the family with the standing to enforce a boundary, and the one whose own long experience of surveillance made her an authority on how to survive it. She had spent 30 years working out what could be conceded and what could not. After May 1994, that knowledge left the household. The woman who moved into North Moore Street was inheriting a situation without the person who had known how to manage it. There is one more element of her professional background that is worth putting on the record, because it complicates the story that was later told about her. She was not naive about publicity. She had spent years watching famous women prepare themselves to be photographed, and she had watched what the resulting coverage did to them. She had been in the rooms afterward, when the pictures came out. She had a working understanding of the tabloid economy that most people entering that world do not possess. She married him anyway. That is not a judgment. It is the fact that makes the later accounts of a woman blindsided by fame difficult to sustain in their simplest form. Whatever she thought she was accepting, she was not accepting it blind. She had a technical education in exactly this. The reasonable inference, and it is an inference, is that she believed the apparatus could be managed because managing it was what she did for a living, and that she was working from a model in which the subject retains some control over supply. That model held for people who could stop appearing. It did not describe what was about to happen to her, because the photographs of her were not being produced with her cooperation and could not be reduced by withholding it. She left Calvin Klein shortly after the wedding. The specifics of the departure are not well documented, whether it was framed as a leave, a resignation, or something negotiated. The result is not in question. She never held another job. She was 30 years old. She had built a career on the management of appearances, and she gave it up at the precise moment when her own appearance became the most commercially valuable in New York. The last stretch of relative quiet lasted about 4 months. On a Sunday afternoon in late February 1997, in Washington Square Park, they had an argument in public, and a man with a camcorder recorded it. It was a Sunday in late February 1996, cold, with the low gray light that Washington Square Park has in that month. They had the dog with them, a black German Shepherd mix named Friday. They were not at that point publicly engaged. A man in the park had a camcorder. Consumer video cameras had been common for about a decade by then. The tape it produced was low resolution, handheld, with intermittent audio degraded by wind and distance. He recognized them, and he began recording. And he kept recording for something in the region of 25 minutes. What the tape shows is an argument. The specific subject is not audible with any confidence, though the dog is involved in it. There is a stretch where the leash passes between them and the animal circles. She walks away, and he follows. She sits on a bench. He crouches in front of her. At one point, she pulls a ring from her finger and pushes it at him, and he does not take it. And then eventually he does. She is crying. He is talking steadily, close to her face, in the posture of someone trying to hold a conversation together. Near the end of the footage, they are sitting side by side. He puts an arm around her. They kiss. They leave the park together. That is the whole content of it. Two people in their 30s having a bad afternoon in a public park and repairing it before they went home. Every element of it is ordinary. There is nothing on the tape that could not be observed on any given Sunday in any city between any couple in the year before they marry. The man with the camera sold it. The sale is the event, not the argument, the sale. He took the cassette to the tabloid television market, which in 1996 was competitive and cash-rich, and he was paid for it. The footage was broadcast in excerpt, then rebroadcast, then licensed onward. Still frames pulled from the video ran in print. The clip entered permanent circulation and has never left it. It was replayed in 1999 and again at every subsequent anniversary, and it is available now on demand to anyone who wants to watch a woman cry on a bench 30 years ago. She had not consented to the recording. She had no legal recourse. They were in a public park, and the law in New York provides essentially no protection against being filmed in one. She had no ability to buy the tape, or suppress it, or answer it. The first extended moving footage of her that most of the world ever saw was a covert recording of the worst 25 minutes of her week. Consider the difference between this and a photograph. A photograph of a famous couple leaving a restaurant is an image of them in the act of being public. It catches a surface they have already agreed to present. The tape is not that. It has duration. It has a beginning where she is composed and a middle where she is not. It shows her losing an argument or winning one or neither. The ambiguity is the point, because the viewer is placed at the distance of a stranger who cannot hear and is free to invent the words. That invention began immediately and has never stopped. There was also the ring. The gesture, a woman removing a ring and handing it back, carries an obvious reading, and the press took it. Whether the engagement was formal at that point is unclear. The announcement never happened publicly at all, and the relationship's status through the first half of 1996 was a matter of speculation even among people who knew them. The tabloid framing was that the engagement had been broken and repaired in the course of a single afternoon on camera. It is equally possible that a ring came off in anger and went back on 20 minutes later, which is a thing that happens and which has no consequences at all except when it is filmed. 7 months later, they were married on Cumberland Island. That sequence is the useful one, and it is the reverse of how the tape is normally deployed. The footage is almost always presented as evidence of a troubled marriage. It predates the marriage. Whatever was wrong in that park in February, both of them looked at it and at the fact that a stranger had sold it and proceeded to the church in September regardless. The elaborate secrecy of the wedding reads differently once the tape is placed before it. By September 1996, they had a demonstrated case study of what the market would do with them. They knew a private disagreement could be filmed by an amateur, sold within days, and broadcast to millions with no recourse of any kind. The response was the island. No bridge, no phones, no printed location. Guests routed through a city 3 hours away. That was not fastidiousness about a wedding. It was a security posture designed by two people who had recently learned what they were up against, and the extremity of it, the boats, the withheld address, the single released frame, makes sense only as a reaction to something. It also indicates what they believed was possible. The Cumberland Plan assumes that privacy is achievable through sufficient effort. Enough logistics, enough discretion, enough trusted people, and the perimeter holds. It had worked in February for nobody, and it worked in September completely, which may have been the more misleading result. The tape did something else, less visible at the time. Before February 1996, the commercial value of images of Carolyn Bessette derived from her association with him. She was the woman with Kennedy. Her own face was worth something as a component of his. The park footage established a separate market. It sold on her distress specifically. That was the content. That was the reason anyone watched it twice. From that point forward, there was a documented, monetized appetite for pictures of her unhappy, and photographers who stood outside Northmore Street for 11 hours were not waiting for a picture of a marriage. They were waiting for a picture of a fight. This produced a structural problem that nothing in her professional training had prepared her for. In her old job, the subject controlled supply. You decided what to wear, when to appear, which frame to approve. The variable you managed was your own presentation. The new market did not want her presentation. It wanted the moments when presentation failed. She could not withhold those by preparation because they were not performances. The only way to reduce supply was to stop having visible emotions in public, which is to say, to be composed at all times on a street where men were paid to wait for the exception. Her later reputation for coldness, the pressed line of the mouth in 1,000 photographs, the refusal to smile at the lens, the fast walk, was widely read as arrogance. It is at least as consistent with a woman who had watched the tape of herself crying in the park and drawn a conclusion about what her face was worth when it moved. One more thing about the footage deserves attention, because it tends to be edited out. The clip that circulates is usually short. It runs the ring, the crying, the tension, and it ends there. The longer version continues past that. The arm around the shoulder, the kiss, the two of them walking out of the park with the dog. The reconciliation was always on the tape. It has been available for 30 years. It is simply less useful, and so it was cut, and the cut version became the record. That editorial decision, made by a producer in 1996, replicated by every outlet since, is a small, early instance of the process that would eventually determine everything the public believes about her marriage. The material was there. The version that sold was the version with the ending removed. She had 3 years and 5 months left, and for most of them there was a man on the sidewalk outside her door before she woke up. Nearly everything the public believes about the inside of that marriage comes from a small number of books, and every one of them was published after both people in the marriage were dead. This is the central problem with the story, and it is usually left out of the story. The subject cannot be interviewed. Her husband cannot be interviewed. Her parents and sisters have said essentially nothing in 27 years. The friends who did speak often spoke anonymously to authors who had commercial reasons to want a particular version in a market that had already demonstrated it would pay more for conflict than for calm. The result is a record with a specific shape. It is dense in exactly the places where confirmation is impossible and thin in the places where documentation exists. Take the largest single source of the divorce narrative. Edward Klein published 3 books touching on the couple between 2003 and 2007, beginning with The Kennedy Curse, later Just Jackie, and in 2007, The Truth About What Happened, which dealt directly with the final months. Klein was a former editor of the New York Times Magazine, so the books arrived with a professional credential attached, and they sold in volume. They also relied heavily on unnamed sources, on reconstructed dialogue between 2 dead people, and on private scenes for which no witness is identified. Passages describe conversations in the loft on Northmore Street, with no indication of who reported them. Emotional states are asserted directly. Klein's account of the couple's last weeks, a marriage in serious trouble, a wife described in terms of instability, a husband exhausted, is the origin point for a great deal of what circulates now as common knowledge. It was contested at the time. Rosemarie Terenzio, who had worked in the office daily, disputed the characterization publicly and at length. Others in the couple's circle described the books as substantially invented. There is no way to adjudicate this from outside, which is precisely the condition Klein was writing in. The 2 people who could have corrected him were at the bottom of the Atlantic. That is not a claim that everything in those books is false. It is a claim about evidentiary weight. A reconstructed private conversation between 2 dead people, sourced to no one, cannot support a documentary's central assertion. It can only be reported as a claim that was made. Then there is Michael Bergen. Bergen was a model from Connecticut who appeared in Calvin Klein underwear advertising in the early 1990s and later acted on television. He and Carolyn Bessette were involved before her relationship with Kennedy began. That much is not disputed by anyone. In 2004, he published The Other Man, John F. Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette, and Me, in which he described their relationship as having continued intermittently after she was with Kennedy and after she married him. The book asserted contact in the final years, including a claim of communication in the weeks before her death. The book is the only detailed first-person account by someone who says he was intimately involved with her, and it is the sole source for most of the affair narrative. It was published 5 years after her death, into a market where her name still sold, by a man whose acting career had not gone the way his modeling had. He was interviewed extensively on its release. Set against that, no corroborating witness came forward, no correspondence was produced, and the people who had been physically present in her daily life during those years rejected the account. Terenzio, again, was among the most direct in doing so. Bergen has never retracted it. What can be said with confidence is narrow. They had a relationship. It ended, or largely ended, when she began seeing Kennedy. Everything after that point rests on one man's memory, published for money, about a woman who could not respond. The reason this matters is not moral. It is structural because these 2 source bodies, Klein and Bergen, supply most of the load-bearing material in the case that the marriage was near collapse. Remove them, and the remaining evidence for a divorce is considerably thinner than the public conversation suggests. What survives their removal is worth listing, because it is real. There are photographs, thousands of them, and some show tension. There is the 1996 park footage. There are reports, published in mainstream outlets in 1999 and attributed to friends, that the couple had consulted a marriage counselor in the spring of that year. There are accounts of separate nights, of her declining to accompany him to public events, of a difficult period around the failing magazine. Several of these appeared in Vanity Fair and the New York Times in the weeks after the crash, sourced to people identified only by their relationship to the couple. That body of evidence establishes a marriage under strain in 1999. It does not establish an imminent divorce, and the distance between those 2 statements is where this entire documentary sits. There is a further complication in the sourcing that is rarely acknowledged. Almost every account of her personality comes from people who met her through him: his friends, his cousins, his colleagues, his assistant. The circle that spoke to journalists was, overwhelmingly, the Kennedy side of the room, and the descriptions that emerged from it are notably split. Some warm, some distinctly not, several suggesting she was difficult, moody, resistant to the family's expectations. Her own side did not speak. Her mother and stepfather issued no accounts. Her surviving sister has given no interviews of substance. Her Calvin Klein colleagues largely stayed quiet. Her closest friend, Carol Radziwill, eventually wrote about that period, but her book, What Remains, published in 2005, is principally about her own husband's death and treats her friend with visible protectiveness. So the record contains a woman described mostly by her husband's people in a story about whether she was good enough for her husband, told after she died in her husband's plane. The asymmetry is total, and it produced the version that hardened into fact: a difficult wife, a beleaguered husband, a marriage he was tolerating. There is a comparison worth making here, though it should be made carefully. Her mother-in-law had faced the same market and left almost no direct testimony either. Jacqueline Onassis gave few interviews after 1964 and none of consequence about her private life. But she had 4 decades, an institutional position, and, critically, she outlived nearly all the men who wanted to write about her, and she litigated when necessary. She sued the photographer Ron Galella twice, in 1972 and 1981, and obtained court orders restricting how close he could come to her and her children. That is what a defended reputation looks like. It requires time, money, lawyers, and above all, being alive. Carolyn Bessette, Kennedy had 33 years, 3 of them public, and no opportunity to answer anything. The books arrived when she had been dead 4 years and 8 years. There was no estate motivated to contest them, no surviving spouse, no sibling willing to enter public argument. The field was open. One small piece of evidence cuts against the whole apparatus, and it is worth putting beside the books. In the summer of 1999, the couple were planning together. There was a trip to Martha's Vineyard the weekend of the 16th of July for the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy at the family compound in Hyannisport. Her sister Lauren was traveling with them. They had a joint social calendar for the autumn. The lease and life at North Moore Street continued. None of that proves a happy marriage. People plan weekends inside failing marriages constantly. But it is the kind of evidence that has a paper trail: flight plans, guest lists, the physical fact of a sister in the back seat of a small plane on a Friday night, and it sits awkwardly against a narrative of imminent separation in a way that reconstructed dialogue does not. What the documented record supports is this: a marriage of 2 years and 10 months under sustained external pressure, with a difficult spring in 1999, involving at least one period of professional counseling, between 2 people who were still living together, still traveling together, and still committed to a shared calendar on the day it ended. What the commercial record supports is a woman on the edge of divorce. These are not the same finding, and only one of them has ever been asked to show its evidence. The strain itself was real, and it had causes that can be traced without recourse to anonymous sources. One of them began the month after the wedding, when she stopped going to work. She left Calvin Klein in the autumn of 1996, within weeks of the wedding. The precise terms are not documented. Whether it was a resignation, a negotiated exit, or a leave that quietly became permanent, no one involved has ever specified, and the company said nothing. What is certain is that she never worked again. The reasoning available at the time was practical and probably correct. Her job required her to be in a showroom with clients whose own publicity was the entire point of the fitting. She could not stand in a room with an actress being dressed for the Oscars while photographers waited outside the building for her. The presence of a Kennedy in the office would have restructured everything the office was for. Colleagues later described the situation as untenable in exactly those terms, that she had become a liability to the discretion her role depended on. There was also no financial requirement. He had money in the tens of millions and a magazine to run. Nothing about the household needed her salary. So the decision was reasonable, and it was made quickly, and it removed from her life every structure she had built in the previous decade. Consider what actually left with the job: a reason to be somewhere at a fixed hour. Roughly 40 people who knew her as a professional rather than as a wife, a domain in which she was expert and other people were not, a source of income that belonged to her, a social circle unconnected to her husband, a set of daily problems whose difficulty was manageable and whose solutions were hers. She was 30 years old, and she had been, by every account, extremely good at her work. Susan Sokol had recruited her out of a Boston store on the strength of watching her handle customers for a few minutes. She had risen fast in a company that does not promote for sentiment. That was the identity she had constructed for herself before anyone outside Manhattan knew her name. After October 1996, there was no obvious replacement for any of it. The days that followed are not well documented, which is itself part of the situation. There were no meetings to attend, no colleagues to record her arrival. The photographic record, which is dense, shows a woman leaving her building at irregular hours, going to lunch, going to a gym, walking the dog, shopping, going home. The pictures exist because there was nothing else to photograph. Friends described her as involved in his work at George, unofficially. She appeared at the magazine's offices. She had opinions about the covers, which she was qualified to have, but she held no position there, and the accounts from inside the office place her as a visitor rather than a participant. Terencio's version has her present, funny, occasionally exasperated, and unmistakably outside the operation. There was talk, at various points, of other ventures. Nothing was announced, nothing launched. The public role available to her was the one the family had a template for, and it was not a job. It was appearance at events, support for his projects, presence at charitable functions in a supporting capacity. Carolyn Kennedy had built something substantial out of a version of that: books, the Library Foundation, a public identity of her own within the family's terms. But Carolyn was born inside it and had 30 years of practice. The version offered to Carolyn required her to be photographed constantly for work she was not being credited with, on behalf of a family that had not decided about her, in exchange for no professional standing of any kind. She largely declined it. This became one of the more durable charges against her. She did not go to things. Through 1997 and 1998, there is a pattern in the record of him attending events alone, of her withdrawal from the parts of the calendar that involved the family and its causes. It was noticed, and it was reported, and the interpretation offered was aloofness, a wife who considered herself above the obligations she had married into. The alternative reading requires no special sympathy. Attending an event meant a gauntlet at both ends. It meant photographs that would be printed with commentary on her body, her expression, her marriage. It meant being assessed, every time, against a dead woman. It meant contributing to a supply of images she had no ability to control, and which had already been demonstrated to be worth more when she looked unhappy. Every appearance she made produced material that could be used against her, and she was being paid nothing to make them. The withdrawal narrowed her considerably. By 1998, the descriptions from people who knew her have her at home a great deal. In an apartment she could not leave unobserved, in a neighborhood where her front door was a workplace for other people. There was a further consequence, less discussed, and it concerns dependence. Her income was gone. Her professional network had been built on an employer she had left. Her social life ran increasingly through his friends, his cousins, his colleagues, in a family whose loyalty structure did not extend to her automatically. She had no separate money, no separate work, no separate standing. A marriage in which one party has surrendered every independent structure is not thereby unhappy. Plenty of such marriages function, but it is asymmetrical in a specific way. It means that if things go badly, one party's difficulty is a problem, and the other party's difficulty is a crisis of the whole arrangement. She had, by 1998, very little that did not depend on him. Her own family remained: her mother, her stepfather, her sisters, Lauren in particular, who worked at Morgan Stanley and had a life in Hong Kong and then New York, and who was close to her. Carol Radziwill, married to John's cousin Anthony, was her closest friend and one of the few people in the family orbit who was also, unambiguously, hers. Those relationships mattered enormously, and two of the three people named would be dead within 18 months of each other. There is one detail from this period that is documented and difficult to place, and it should stand without much commentary. Photographs from 1997 and 1998 show her repeatedly walking on Manhattan sidewalks alone, moving fast, sunglasses on, no smile. Hundreds of frames. They were printed at the time as evidence of auteur. The Ice Queen, the difficult wife. They are also simply a record of a woman going out to do something on an ordinary weekday in a life that had recently contained an office, a title, and a reason to be there. There is no way to establish what she felt about any of this. She did not write about it publicly, gave no interviews, and left no statement. Everything above is circumstance rather than testimony, which is the honest position. What the circumstance establishes is a set of conditions. In under 3 years, she had gone from a professional with her own income, expertise, and colleagues to a woman with none of those in a household organized entirely around her husband's work. Under surveillance, she could not escape, in a family that assessed her constantly. Whatever strain existed in the spring of 1999 arrived in a marriage already carrying that, and the surveillance was not incidental to it. By 1998, the men outside the building had become a fixed feature of daily life, with a working economy behind them and a price list that made her the most valuable non-celebrity in the city. The building at 20 North Moore Street is a red brick warehouse conversion at the corner of Varick, in what was then a working part of Tribeca. The couple occupied the top floor, roughly 4,000 square feet, bought in 1996 for a figure reported around $2.5 million. It had good light and a view over the low rooftops of the neighborhood. Its defining feature, for the purposes of what happened there, was the door. One entrance, opening directly onto the sidewalk, on a corner visible from two streets. No garage, no motor court, no basement access to a side street. The kind of building where a person carrying groceries has to cross 10 feet of public pavement between the car and the lobby every single time, and where the position of the door is known to anyone who wants to know it. By the winter of 1996, that pavement had become a place of business. The men who worked it were freelancers, mostly. A few were on retainer to agencies. Most sold frame by frame to whoever bid. They worked in shifts of a kind, informally coordinated, and the coordination was not friendly. They were competing with each other for the same seconds. Some arrived before 6 in the morning. Some stayed until the lights went out. The neighborhood in that period had no reason for anyone to loiter, so their presence was conspicuous, and it did not diminish. The rates are the part that explains the persistence. An ordinary shot of John Kennedy Jr. alone, walking on a bicycle, going to the office, was worth a few $100s in the domestic market. A clean shot of the two of them together, in decent light, was worth several thousand. A shot of them arguing, or of her crying, or of her turning away with her hand up, was worth substantially more than that, and could be syndicated internationally for weeks. The European and Australian markets paid separately. A genuinely exclusive image, a first, an unexpected setting, visible distress, could reach 5 figures. Set that against the cost of standing on a sidewalk. One good frame paid for a month of waiting. There was no economic reason for anyone to leave. She was, by 1998, among the most photographed women in the world, and she had never in her life sought a photograph. The distinction between her situation and her husband's was structural and is worth stating precisely. He had a transactional relationship with the press. He needed coverage for the magazine. He gave interviews, held press conferences, made himself available in exchange for attention, directed where he wanted it. He had also been photographed since infancy. The famous images of a small boy under a desk in the Oval Office, the salute at the funeral at 3 years old, and had built, over 3 decades, a functional tolerance. He waved, he joked with them, he knew their names. When he was tired of it, he got on his bicycle and outrode them, which he did frequently and with evident enjoyment. She had nothing to sell them and nothing to gain. Coverage did not advance a career because she no longer had one. There was no transaction available. She was pure supply. This produced a stance that the press read as hostility, and that was, in operational terms, the only rational response. She did not smile at the lens. She did not stop. She did not acknowledge them, or thank them, or ask them to move. She walked at speed, with her chin down and her expression flat, and she did that for 3 years. The flatness is visible in essentially every photograph, and it became her public character. Cold, imperious, ungrateful, a woman who had married into extraordinary luck and had the poor manners not to appear pleased about it. What the photographs actually record is a technique. A face that does not move produces images that are interchangeable, and interchangeable images are worth less than distinctive ones. She had spent 5 years in fashion, learning what makes a photograph valuable. She was, quite plausibly, depressing her own market the only way available to her. It did not work because the volume compensated for the flatness and because there was no floor under the demand. The practical arrangements of her daily life reorganized themselves around the door. Cars for short distances, departures at odd hours, routes chosen for the number of exits, errands consolidated to reduce the number of transits, restaurants selected for their back rooms and their staff, friends' apartments used as staging points, the gym, the dry cleaner, the market. Each of these became a decision with a surveillance component. The couple also had a house on Martha's Vineyard, on the family land at Redgate Farm in Aquina, inherited from his mother, 350 acres, a private road, and the closest thing to an unwatched exterior available to either of them. They used it when they could. The pattern of their weekends bent toward places with gates. What accumulates in the record is not any single dramatic incident. It is repetition. Thousands of frames of a woman crossing 10 feet of sidewalk, dated, sequential, running from October 1996 to July 1999 with no significant interruption. Attention of this kind normally decays. A new couple is worth a great deal for 6 months, and then the market moves on, because the pictures become repetitive and the buyers get bored. Hers did not decay, and the reason is a matter of some interest. Part of it was the mother-in-law. The public had spent 40 years watching a woman who never explained herself, and the arrival of another silent, elegant blonde into the same family activated the entire apparatus of comparison. Every photograph of Carolyn was implicitly a photograph about Jackie. Part of it was the fashion press, which had discovered her independently. Her clothes were copied, her hair colorist became famous, the plain black slip dress and the bare face became a look with a name attached, sold at every price point in America. This gave her a second, separate constituency of interest that had nothing to do with the Kennedys and did not lose interest when the marriage stopped being new. And part of it was the silence. She gave no interviews, not one, ever, of any substance. She never authorized a profile, never sat with a magazine, never explained a single thing about her life. In a market that runs on access, total unavailability creates a vacuum, and the vacuum is filled by photographs and by other people's accounts. The refusal, that was meant to protect her, guaranteed that the only version of her in circulation would be one she had no hand in. There was one avenue of recourse, and it had been used before within the same family. Jacqueline Onassis had sued Ron Galella in 1972 and obtained a restraining order setting a distance he was required to keep from her and her children. When he violated it, she brought contempt proceedings in 1981 and effectively ended his ability to approach her. It took 9 years, considerable legal expense, and a plaintiff of extraordinary standing, and it produced a boundary enforceable by a court. No equivalent action was ever brought on behalf of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Whether the option was considered is not known. The obstacles were real. Galella had been a single, identifiable defendant engaged in physical pursuit, whereas the North Moore Street operation was a rotating group of a dozen men standing lawfully on a public street, which is much harder to enjoin. A suit would also have generated exactly the coverage it sought to prevent. The boundary that had been won in 1981 by one woman in that family was not available to the next one, and she absorbed the difference personally for 3 years at the rate of a few $1,000s a frame paid to someone else. By the winter of 1998, the pictures show a woman who had stopped performing composure and had simply become opaque. The scrutiny outside the door was constant and impersonal, and it was in some ways easier to categorize than what was happening inside the family, where the assessment was continuous, unspoken, and conducted by people whose approval she could not obtain by any available means. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died on the 19th of May, 1994, at her apartment on Fifth Avenue of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was 64. Her son stood outside the building afterward and told the press that she had died surrounded by her family and her books, and the people and things she loved, and that she had done it in her own way and on her own terms. The relationship between Carolyn Bessette and John Kennedy Jr. began in earnest that same year. Whether they had met before the death is unclear. The accounts vary, as they do about everything in this period. What is not in dispute is that the woman who moved into his life did so in the immediate aftermath of his mother's, and that she never met her. That fact organized a great deal of what followed. Jacqueline Onassis had held a position in that family which no one else occupied. She was not a Kennedy by blood, had never been fully absorbed into the Hyannisport culture, and had spent 30 years constructing a separate authority based on her own conduct. She was also, in practical terms, her son's principal advisor on the problem that would define his wife's life: how to be looked at continuously without being consumed. She had solved it, insofar as it can be solved. Say almost nothing. Never explain. Work. She had spent nearly 2 decades as a book editor at Viking and then Doubleday, going into an office, holding a title, keeping a domain that was hers. Litigate when the line is crossed, give the public a surface, and defend everything behind it. None of that knowledge was transmitted. The person who possessed it died before the person who needed it arrived. What was transmitted instead was the comparison. It began in the press before the wedding and never stopped. Every photograph of Carolyn Bessette was captioned into a lineage: the dark glasses, the hair, the silence, the refusal to smile. Columnists wrote about the second coming of Jackie, then about how she fell short of it, then about the presumption of the comparison itself, and each iteration produced more coverage. The comparison was structurally unwinnable. Jacqueline Onassis had been a first lady, a widow of a national assassination, a figure of 40 years standing whose public character had been shaped by a catastrophe the whole country had watched. The woman being measured against her was a 30-year-old former fashion executive from Greenwich who had been married for 18 months. There was also, inevitably, the physical comparison, and the fashion press ran it constantly. The dresses, the hair color, the silhouettes, side by side in magazine spreads. A woman who had worked in that industry knew precisely how those layouts were built and what they were for. The family itself is harder to document, and the record must be handled carefully here, because most of what exists comes from people on that side of the room. The Kennedys of that generation were numerous, competitive, physically boisterous, and organized around a set of rituals. Hyannisport, touch football, sailing, the compound in summer, that functioned as both family life and admission test. New spouses were absorbed by participation. You showed up, you played, you took the teasing, you did not stand apart. Multiple accounts describe her as not doing this well. She was urban, private, thin-skinned about being observed, and disinclined to perform enthusiasm on demand. She reportedly did not enjoy Hyannisport and did not go often. Some cousins found her distant. Others, notably, did not. Anthony and Carol Radziwill were close to her, and several of the younger family members described her warmly afterward. The split in these accounts is real and probably reflects a real split in the family. It also reflects who was talking. The unflattering versions circulated more because they were more useful. There is a particular expectation embedded in that family's history that bears on all of this, and it can be stated without any interpretation of her feelings about it, because it is a matter of record spanning decades. Wives in that family absorbed difficulty privately. Rose Kennedy did, for a lifetime, through her husband's conduct and the deaths of 4 children. Ethel Kennedy did, through widowhood and the losses that followed. Joan Kennedy did, through a marriage that included Chappaquiddick and its aftermath. And her difficulties eventually became public, and the family's handling of that was not gentle. Jacqueline Kennedy did, conspicuously and at great cost, through infidelities that were widely known in Washington and never once acknowledged by her. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute an expectation. The men's lives were the public event, and the wives were responsible for the containment of everything that went wrong around it. Complaint was a failure of the role. A woman who married into that in 1996 inherited the expectation without inheriting any of the compensating apparatus. No political project, no institutional position, no children, and no mother-in-law. The absence of children is worth noting only because it was noted constantly at the time. By 1998, the tabloid coverage had shifted into open speculation about whether she was pregnant, whether she wanted to be, whether the marriage was failing because she was not. Photographs were examined for evidence. There were recurring stories about fertility, sourced to nobody. The couple never addressed any of it. Whether they were trying is not known and is not the documentary's business. What is documentable is that a private matter of that kind was made into public property, weekly, in print, for 2 years, and that in that family, the production of children had always been part of what a wife was understood to be for. The pressure was therefore multidirectional and had no available response. The press wanted access, and giving it was impossible. The family wanted participation, and providing it meant more press. Withdrawal from either produced criticism from both. And she had, since the autumn of 1996, no independent standing from which to absorb any of it. There is a detail from this period that is documented and that resists easy use. At the funeral in July 1999, the eulogy for John Kennedy was given by Senator Edward Kennedy at St. Thomas More Church in Manhattan. It was long, and it was substantially about his nephew, his childhood, his character, his mother, his father, the family. Carolyn and Lauren Bessette were spoken of, but briefly, and the memorial for the 2 sisters was a separate event at a different church. The family had lost a son. Another family had lost 2 daughters. The 2 ceremonies were held apart, and only one of them was broadcast. That was not cruelty, and it should not be read as such. It was a difference in scale between 2 families' relationships to public grief, and it is simply the last instance of a difference that had operated for 3 years. By the spring of 1999, the pressures had a new source, and it was financial. His magazine was in serious trouble, and the trouble was consuming him. George launched in September 1995. The first cover showed Cindy Crawford dressed as George Washington, bare midriffed, in a powdered wig. The press conference announcing it was held at Federal Hall, and John Kennedy Jr. stood in front of the assembled media, and made jokes about his own reputation. The premise was that politics could be covered as culture, that the readers who bought fashion magazines could be sold politicians in the same register. He was editor-in-chief. The publishing partner was Hachette Filipaki, which put up the capital in exchange for the commercial value of his name on the masthead. The first year was, by circulation standards, a success. It sold 500,000 copies. Advertisers came for the novelty and for the proximity. Whatever the criticism from the political press, and there was a great deal, most of it condescending, the magazine had found an audience. The problem was the second and third years. Advertising revenue declined through 1997 and 1998. Circulation slipped from the launch figures. The editorial identity that had made it novel proved difficult to sustain. Readers who wanted politics found it insufficiently serious. Readers who wanted celebrity found it insufficiently entertaining. And the middle position that had seemed clever in 1995 was harder to hold 20 issues in. The magazine's losses ran into the millions annually. Hachette's contract with him was reportedly structured with an exit point in 1999. As that date approached, the partnership's continuation became a live question, and by the spring of that year, it was understood inside the industry that Hachette was unlikely to renew on the existing terms. He began looking for outside investors. Through the first half of 1999, he took meetings with people who might buy in or buy out, reportedly including approaches to Wall Street financiers and other publishers. In July, he met with Jack Welch's people at General Electric, an approach that was in progress at the time of his death. He was 38 years old and spending his time trying to keep alive a business that carried his name and had consumed a substantial amount of his own money. The strain of this is one of the few things in 1999 that multiple independent sources agree on. Colleagues described him as preoccupied, working long hours, traveling for meetings, distracted. The magazine had become the central fact of his working life, and it was failing in public, reviewed as a vanity project by people who had said so from the beginning. There is a second thread running through the same period, and it concerns aviation. He had obtained his private pilot's license in April 1998 at Vero Beach, Florida, after training at Flight Safety Academy. He flew a Cessna 182 initially, then in April 1999 purchased a Piper Saratoga 2 HP, a heavier, faster, more complex aircraft with retractable landing gear and a higher workload than the plane he had trained on. He had accumulated something in the region of 300 flight hours by mid-1999. He held a visual flight rules certificate. He had begun instrument training but had not completed it and was not instrument rated, meaning he was not certified to fly by reference to instruments alone in conditions without a visible horizon. On the 30th of May, 1999, 6 weeks before the crash, he broke his ankle in a paragliding accident on Martha's Vineyard. He was in a cast for much of June and into July, and the ankle was still healing on the 16th of July. The injury is documented in the subsequent NTSB investigation, which noted that he had been using crutches and that the cast had been removed only days earlier. Reports from the period suggest his wife was uneasy about his flying. This is one of the claims that appears in the post-1999 books and cannot be independently verified, though it appears in enough separate accounts, including from people not obviously commercial, to carry some weight. She had reportedly flown with him a number of times and had reservations. What is documented is that she flew with him on the 16th of July, and so did her sister. The financial picture of the household in 1999 is worth stating plainly because it complicates the popular version. He was wealthy, but not limitlessly so. His inheritance from his mother's estate, shared with his sister, was substantial. The 1996 auction of Jacqueline Onassis's possessions had realized over $34 million, and there was property, including Red Gate Farm on the vineyard. He was worth something in the tens of millions. But George was losing money, His personal investment in it was significant, and the magazine's survival past 1999 was uncertain. He was in the position of a man whose principal professional undertaking might be about to end publicly at 38 with his name on it. Meanwhile, his wife had no income and had not worked in nearly 3 years. This is the environment in which the reports of marital difficulty in the spring of 1999 arise, and it is a context that the divorce narrative tends to strip out. The strain that people described was not occurring in a vacuum. It was occurring in a household where the husband was working 80-hour weeks to save a failing business, was traveling constantly to meet potential investors, had a broken ankle, and was distracted and exhausted. And where the wife had no work of her own, could not leave the building unphotographed, and was watching her closest friend's husband die. Whether that marriage was ending or simply having a very bad year is precisely the question the record cannot settle. And the difference between those two things is one that most marriages contain at some point without resolution. There is a small piece of evidence from the last weeks that is often used and rarely examined. In the July 1999 issue of George, he published an editor's letter accompanying a feature that involved his cousins Joseph and Michael Kennedy, in which he wrote about family and about people who had lost their way. The issue also included a photograph of himself, nude from behind, contemplating an apple, a reference to Adam. It was widely read after his death as valedictory, as a man in some kind of reckoning. It was, more prosaically, an editor trying to generate attention for a magazine that needed it. He had done versions of this repeatedly since 1995. The retrospective reading requires knowing what happened afterward, which is the definition of a reading that proves nothing. By the beginning of July, the calendar for the rest of the summer was set. There was the wedding of his cousin Rory at Hyannisport on the 17th. There was the Vineyard House. There were meetings scheduled for the following week concerning the magazine's future, and in an apartment across town, Anthony Radziwill was in the final weeks of a 5-year illness, and his wife had been at the hospital nearly every day, and the woman who was closest to both of them had almost no one else left. Anthony Radziwill was the son of Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Onassis's sister, and Prince Stanisław Radziwiłł. He was born in London in August 1959 and grew up between England and America. He and John Kennedy Jr. were first cousins, born a year apart, and by every account the closest thing either had to a brother. He worked in television. He was a producer at ABC News, where he had won Emmys, and where in the early 1990s he met a young producer from a working-class family in Suffolk County named Carol DeFalco. They married in 1994. Jacqueline Onassis was ill that spring and died 2 months before the wedding. By then, Anthony had already been diagnosed. It was a rare cancer, fibrous histiocytoma, a soft tissue sarcoma, first found in 1989 when he was 29. He was treated, and it came back. It was treated again, and it came back again. Over 5 years, there were surgeries in New York and in Baltimore and in Switzerland, removals of tumors from his abdomen, his lung, his throat. He continued working between treatments. He lost weight and regained it and lost it again. Carol Radziwill later wrote about this period in What Remains, published in 2005, a book primarily about her husband's illness and about the friendship that formed around it. It is the single most valuable source on the last 18 months of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's life, and it is valuable precisely because it is not about her. She appears in it, incidentally, as a friend who was present, which is a very different kind of evidence than a book written to explain her. What the book establishes is that the two couples were, by 1998 and 1999, largely each other's world. The four of them traveled together. They spent time at the Vineyard. When Anthony was in hospital, they were in the room. Carol and Carolyn spoke constantly. The friendship between the two women had begun as an accident of marriage and had become, by the final year, the primary relationship in both their lives. It is worth being specific about why that friendship worked, because the reasons illuminate the rest. Carol DeFalco had entered the same family from outside, without money, without a background that the Hyannis Port Circuit recognized. She had been assessed in the same way and had found the same things difficult. She was, in the exact sense, the only other person in the world in Carolyn's position, a woman who had married one of those two cousins and was living with the consequences. And she was, by 1998, in a situation that made everything else look small. Her husband was dying slowly, over years, and she was managing it. Through the winter and spring of 1999, Anthony's condition deteriorated. The treatments had run out of options. He was thin, in constant discomfort, and it was understood by everyone around him that the illness would end within months. Carolyn Bessette was present for this. That is documented in Carol's account and corroborated by others. She visited, she sat in hospital rooms. She was one of the small number of people who did not disappear as the illness moved into its final stage, which is a thing that happens more often than people admit. Consider the position she was in by the summer of 1999. She had no job and had not had one in nearly 3 years. Her husband was working relentlessly on a magazine that was failing and traveling to meet investors. Her closest friend was fully occupied with her husband's death. The man dying was her husband's cousin and closest friend, which meant the grief coming was also going to be his, and she would be expected to hold it for him. Her social circle had contracted to almost nothing that was not inside this situation. She could not go outside without being photographed. She had, by that point, been in the tabloids continuously for 4 years, described as cold, described as difficult, described as childless, described as failing. There are accounts from this period, again post hoc, again from the compromised sources, describing her as low, as withdrawn, as struggling. Some of the more aggressive versions attach specific pathologies to it. Those claims cannot be substantiated and will not be repeated here. What can be said is that the circumstances of her life in the first half of 1999 were objectively difficult, and that describing a woman in those circumstances as unstable when she had no ability to answer was a commercially useful thing to do in 2003. Anthony Radziwill was 39 years old and had weeks left. There is an arrangement in that final spring that is worth stating without embellishment. The 4 of them had been each other's closest company. 2 of the 4 were about to die within 3 weeks of each other, in entirely unrelated ways, one after 5 years of illness, and one in 90 seconds off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Carol Radziwill would be the only one of the 4 left. She has said, since, that she did not tell her husband about the plane. He was in hospital by then, unresponsive for periods. There is some disagreement about how much he understood. He died on the 10th of August, 1999, 3 weeks after the crash, and it is not clear whether he ever fully knew. The last weeks of that July had a shape that no one involved could see. On Friday the 16th, the plan was to fly to Martha's Vineyard, drop Lauren Bessette at the airport there, and continue to Hyannis Port for Roy Kennedy's wedding the following day. Lauren was in town from Hong Kong, staying at a hotel, and had arranged to meet them at the Essex County Airport in New Jersey. It was a routine domestic arrangement of the kind that fills every summer. A wedding, a sister's visit, 2 flights, a weekend at a family house. The strain in the marriage, whatever its exact dimensions, and the honest answer is that they are not knowable, existed inside a household that was also grieving in advance, financially anxious, professionally uncertain, exhausted, and under observation. The reports of a marriage in serious trouble in the spring of 1999 are probably true in some form. Nearly everything else in that household was in trouble at the same time, and the record has generally reported the marriage as though it were the only thing happening. In April or May of that year, by several accounts, they went to see a counselor. The claim appears first in the weeks after the crash, in the mainstream press rather than the tabloids, attributed to friends who were not named, that in the spring of 1999, the couple had consulted a marriage counselor. It has been repeated ever since. It is the single most substantial piece of evidence for the divorce narrative, and it is worth handling carefully because it is treated as though it settles a question, and it does not. Take the claim at its strongest. Assume it is true, and it probably is, since it appeared quickly in multiple outlets from separate directions, in a form that is unglamorous and does not obviously benefit anyone who reported it. Assume they sat in a room with a professional in April or May of 1999 and discussed their marriage. What that establishes is that two people believed their marriage had problems serious enough to warrant help, and that they sought it. What it does not establish is a divorce. Marriage counseling is, by definition, an intervention undertaken by people who have not yet decided to leave. The population of couples in counseling includes those who separate and those who do not, in proportions that no one has ever been able to predict from the fact of attendance alone. A couple heading straight for divorce lawyers does not usually stop at a therapist first. The inference that has been drawn from this fact runs backwards. It takes an action whose ordinary meaning is an attempt to continue, and reads it as evidence of an intention to end. The other reported details from that spring belong in the same category. There were accounts of separate nights, that he had stayed at hotels or at a friend's place after arguments, that there were periods of distance. This appears in several sources of varying reliability. It is entirely plausible. It is also the most common feature of a bad stretch in a marriage that continues. There were accounts of her declining to attend events with him. This is documented across the whole 3 years and is not specific to 1999. There were accounts of arguments, some of them witnessed by staff at the magazine and by people in the building. Terenzio, who was in a position to know and who has generally defended the marriage, has acknowledged that things were difficult in that period, and there was the visible weight of everything covered in the previous chapters: the magazine failing, the ankle, the exhaustion, the dying cousin, the woman with no work of her own, and men outside her door. Set against that is a different category of evidence, less quotable but harder to dispute, because it consists of arrangements rather than impressions. They were living together at North Moore Street on the 16th of July, 1999. They were flying together that evening to a family wedding, which is not an event one attends alone if a separation is underway, and which would have placed them in front of the entire Kennedy family for a weekend. Her sister Lauren was traveling with them, having arranged to be picked up in New Jersey. A family arrangement that assumes a functioning household. They had social commitments booked into the autumn. There was no legal action of any kind. No attorney has ever come forward. No filing existed. No separation agreement was in progress. No property had been divided. And in 3 decades, no document has surfaced. There was reportedly a plan for a holiday later that summer. That is the whole of it. On one side, credible reports of a marriage under serious strain, including counseling. On the other, a couple physically together, traveling together with family, with a shared calendar, and no legal step of any kind taken toward ending anything. A responsible reading of both sets of facts produces something less satisfying than a headline. A marriage of not quite 3 years, going through its worst period, with 2 people actively working on it. At the moment it stopped. There's a reason the stronger version took hold anyway, and it has to do with what happened after. By 2003, both principals had been dead 4 years. The market for Kennedy material was large and permanent. A book asserting a troubled marriage was more valuable than a book asserting an ordinary one, and there was nobody with standing and motive to contest it. No widow, no widower, no estate with a reputational interest, and a Bessette family that had chosen silence and never departed from it. Under those conditions, the strongest available claim wins by default, not because it was proved, but because nothing was arrayed against it. The counseling detail then performed a specific function in that literature. It is the one hard-looking fact in a body of material otherwise made of unnamed friends and reconstructed dialogue. Everything softer could be attached to it, and the whole assembly could be presented as evidence-based. Strip the counseling back to what it actually is: two people trying, and the structure loses its foundation. There is a further difficulty in the divorce narrative that its proponents rarely address. She had no independent income and had not worked since 1996. She had no separate property of consequence. A divorce would have removed her from the household without restoring anything she had given up, and it would have generated the largest wave of coverage of her life, in which she would have been the woman who could not manage a marriage the whole world had watched. None of that means she would not have left if she wanted to. Women leave marriages under worse conditions constantly. But it does mean that the practical position of a woman contemplating divorce in that household was extremely poor, and that any account which treats the decision as straightforward is not describing a real situation. There is one more consideration, and it is the least comfortable. The public appetite for the divorce story has always had a particular flavor. It requires her to have been unhappy, difficult, unstable, and on her way out, which is to say, it requires the least sympathetic available version of a woman who never spoke. A marriage that was struggling and might have recovered is a story about two ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. A marriage that was over is a story about a woman who failed at the only thing the public had assigned her to do. The second version sold better for 27 years. What happened on the evening of Friday the 16th of July is documented in considerable detail because the National Transportation Safety Board investigated it and published its findings, and the record of those final hours is the one part of this story that rests on evidence rather than on anyone's account. The National Transportation Safety Board assigned the accident the identifier NYC 99 MAE 178. Its final report, adopted in July 2000, runs to a factual narrative, a probable cause, and several hundred pages of supporting documentation: weather data, radar returns, maintenance logs, training records, interviews with people who saw the aircraft or spoke to the pilot that day. It is the only part of this story assembled by people with no commercial interest in the outcome. The aircraft was a Piper PA-32R 301 Saratoga 2 HP. Registration N9253N, purchased that April. It was a single-engine, six-seat, high-performance airplane with retractable gear and a constant-speed propeller, heavier and more demanding than the Cessna he had trained on, and equipped with a full instrument panel, including an autopilot. The pilot held a private certificate with a single-engine land rating, issued in April 1998. He had logged approximately 310 hours, of which around 55 were at night. He had begun training toward an instrument rating and had not completed it. He was not certified to fly solely by reference to instruments. His flight instructor later told investigators that he had offered to accompany him on the flight that evening and that the offer had been declined. His ankle had been in a cast until the previous week. He was walking with difficulty and had been using crutches within the preceding days. The plan for Friday the 16th was straightforward. Depart Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, fly northeast up the coast, land at Martha's Vineyard to drop Carolyn Bessette, then continue the short distance to Barnstable on Cape Cod for Rory Kennedy's wedding at Hyannis Port the following day. The day did not go to schedule. He worked at the magazine. Lauren was collected in Manhattan. Traffic was bad. The departure, originally intended for around 6 in the evening, slipped repeatedly. The aircraft lifted off from Essex County at approximately 8:38 p.m. Sunset that evening was at 8:14. The weather along the route was legally acceptable for visual flight. Visibility was reported at 5 to 8 miles at the coastal stations, with no cloud layer of consequence and no precipitation. There were no warnings that would have prohibited the flight. What the reported figures did not capture was the condition over the water. There was haze along the southern New England coast that night, a summer atmospheric haze of the kind that reduces visibility gradually with distance rather than presenting a visible boundary. Several pilots flying the same corridor that evening later told investigators that conditions over Rhode Island Sound had been poor in a specific way: no discernible horizon. The sea below was dark, the sky above was hazy, the moon was near new, and the shoreline lights fell away behind as the route crossed open water. Under those conditions, a pilot flying visually has nothing to look at. There is no line where the water ends and the sky begins. The instruments continue to work perfectly. The problem is that a pilot who has not been trained to trust them will tend instead to trust the sensations of the inner ear, which in the absence of visual reference are unreliable. The radar track is the last documentation of the flight. The aircraft flew northeast at around 1,500 feet along the Connecticut shoreline, then out over the water toward the Vineyard. Approaching the island from the west, it began a descent. At approximately 9:38 p.m., about 34 miles west of Martha's Vineyard, the track shows a right turn, then a descent that steepens, then a turn that tightens as the descent accelerates. The final radar returns show a rate of descent exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. The aircraft struck the water about 7.5 miles southwest of Gayhead at high speed, and the impact was not survivable. The NTSB's probable cause was stated as the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. Contributing factors were haze and the dark night. Spatial disorientation is a physiological condition, not a failure of nerve. In the absence of visual reference, the vestibular system misreports attitude, and a gentle bank feels level, while level flight feels like a turn. The resulting pattern, a slow turn that steepens, a descent that accelerates, a spiral tightening toward the surface, is well documented and has a name in aviation medicine. It typically develops over a period of a minute or two. It is survivable only by disregarding what the body reports and flying the instruments, which requires training he had not finished. The wreckage was located on the 21st of July in about 120 feet of water. The bodies were recovered from the seabed near the fuselage. All three were found still within the aircraft. They were cremated, and the ashes of all three were scattered at sea from the destroyer USS Briscoe on the 22nd of July. There is nothing in the investigation that touches the marriage, and this should be said plainly, because the two subjects are frequently blended. The crash was a general aviation accident of a type that occurs regularly and has occurred many times since: a low-time visual-rated pilot, at night, over water, in reduced visibility, without an instrument rating. The NTSB found no mechanical failure, no evidence of incapacitation, no toxicology findings of significance. There was nothing exotic about it except who was aboard. What can be said about the decision to fly is limited, and the temptation to say more should be resisted. He was a licensed pilot, flying legally within the privileges of his certificate, in weather that met the requirements, on a route he had flown before, to a destination he knew. He was also late, tired, recently injured, flying a relatively new and demanding aircraft, and heading out over black water on a hazy night with two passengers, having declined an instructor's company. The question of whether she wanted to be on that aircraft has been asked continuously for 27 years and cannot be answered. She had reportedly been uneasy about his flying. She flew. Her sister flew. There is one detail from the investigation that has always sat uncomfortably in the record, and it should be reported without any attempt to make it mean something. Carolyn Bessette was in the aircraft because it was convenient. She had been in New York on business from Hong Kong, and rather than take a scheduled flight or a ferry to the Vineyard, she accepted a ride from her sister and brother-in-law. She was 34. Carolyn was 33. John was 38. Anne Freeman lost two of her three daughters on the same evening, in the same aircraft, and the memorial for her daughters was held separately from the one the country watched. 3 weeks later, Anthony Radziwill died. The estate matters were settled quietly. His will, drafted in 1997, had provided for his wife, and the arrangements between the estate and the Bessette family were resolved by agreement rather than litigation. The terms were not disclosed and have never been. There was a separate settlement concerning the flight itself, also confidential. Anne Freeman and Richard Freeman said almost nothing, then and since. Lisa Bessette, the surviving twin, has given no interviews of substance in 27 years. Whatever the family knew about that marriage, and they would have known more than anyone, they took the position that it was not for sale, and they have never once moved from it. The consequence of that silence is the thing this documentary has been circling. The books came in 2003 and 2004 and 2007 into an empty field. There was no one to correct them. The version they established has been recycled through every subsequent article, anniversary piece, television special, and internet retrospective, until the assertions of unnamed friends acquired the texture of fact. A woman who never gave a single interview has been explained continuously for a quarter of a century by people who had no obligation to be right. What remains that she made herself is remarkably thin. A wedding photograph she agreed to release. A dress that was copied into every shopping mall in America. The absence of anything else. She has since been recovered in a way, though not as a person. The clothes came back around. Her name attaches now to a particular idea of restraint. The slip dress, the pale hair, the unadorned face, and the images of a woman crossing a sidewalk at speed, taken by men she never consented to, are reposted daily as inspiration. Photographs produced by surveillance have been converted into aesthetics. The circumstances that made her look that way have been edited out, in the same manner the reconciliation was edited out of the park footage in 1996. The question in the title of this film has an answer, and it is unsatisfying. There is no evidence that a divorce was imminent. There is credible evidence of a marriage in a bad period, including counseling in the spring of 1999, inside a household that was also facing a failing business, a dying friend, an injured husband, a wife with no work of her own, and a front door that had become a place of business for a dozen men. Everything beyond that was constructed later by people who profited from it, about two people who could not answer. Whether the marriage would have lasted is not knowable. Marriages in that condition sometimes recover and sometimes do not, and the ones that end leave paperwork behind. This one left a wedding on the calendar for the following afternoon. There is a smaller irony that outlasts all of this. Her mother-in-law had spent 30 years working out how to be looked at without being consumed, and had won, in court, a boundary that could be enforced. She died 2 years before the woman who would need that knowledge most arrived in the family, and no one else in it knew how to teach her. What was left instead was a lesson she had already learned professionally, in a showroom on 7th Avenue, about how images are made and sold and what happens to the person inside them. She spent 3 years trying not to give anything away, and it was taken anyway, and then she was described at length by strangers for 27 years, and the record still does not contain a single sentence in which she speaks for herself.